In the flickering light of oil lamps, the vast marble halls of Rome glowed with a deceptive warmth. Shadows lengthened across gilded columns, whispering secrets of power and fear. It was in these corridors that Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, better known by the mocking nickname Caligula, began to reveal the shape of his reign. Once hailed as a beacon of hope, the young emperor's authority twisted into something Rome had rarely seen so nakedly displayed. The marriage of sexual hunger with political control, the transformation of intimacy into tyranny. The Roman world had long known rulers who abused power, but Caligula elevated violation into ritual. He did not simply command armies or legislate from marble benches. He commanded flesh minds and the dignity of those around him. The palace itself became a stage, and his courtiers unwilling actors in a theatre of cruelty. To dine with him was to risk humiliation. To marry in Rome was to wonder if the emperor would seize your bride for himself. To possess beauty was to invite imperial appetite. No one was safe. Not the senator's wife, not the soldier's daughter, not even those closest by blood. Historians tell us his reign began with promise. Adopted into the lineage of Augustus Caligula's early days seemed a fresh dawn after the long, weary rule of Tiberius. Crowds hailed him as a liberator, as the young prince, whose laughter might sweep away the gloom of Capri's tyrant. He was charming, intelligent, and skilled at winning favor. But beneath the applause, something darker brewed. Whether it was illness, paranoia, or the intoxicating effect of unchecked power, Caligula soon transformed into a man who blurred every boundary Rome held sacred. The most chilling accounts describe banquets, where senators and nobles reclined on couches, waiting for the emperor to speak. Instead, Caligula's gaze would wander over their wives. He would summon a woman with a gesture leading her away under the eyes of her husband, while the room dared not breathe. Minutes later, he would return his expression smug and describe in cruel detail her performance, her body, her willingness, or lack of it. What had been a gathering of Rome's elite became a ritual of degradation. Each nobleman reduced to silent complicity. Each wife transformed into an unwilling pawn in the emperor's display of dominance. Ancient sources like Suetonius and Cassius Dio paint these scenes with morbid fascination. They suggest that for Caligula, sex was never merely private pleasure. It was spectacle. Every conquest was meant to humiliate rivals, to remind Rome that he owned not just its treasury and armies, but its most intimate bonds. By parading his victims before their peers, he corrupted the very idea of family and honor Roman values that underpinned the Republic and the Empire alike. Rumors multiplied of wives stolen at their weddings, of lovers discarded after a night of incest, whispered with his beloved sister Drusilla. Some of these tales were surely exaggerated by political enemies eager to tarnish a tyrant's image. Yet, their persistence reveals something crucial. Caligula wielded rumor itself as a weapon. By allowing stories of excess to circulate, he deepened the climate of fear. Senators who doubted whether the stories were true lived in dread that tomorrow their household might become the next scandal whispered in Rome's streets. The boundaries of Rome's moral fabric bent and broke under this pressure. Marriage, once a sacred alliance of families, became fragile under his gaze. The banquet hall, once a place of convivial exchange, became an arena of shame. Even the sacred ties of kinship were rumored to have been twisted into tools of domination. To modern ears, these stories echo with both horror and a strange familiarity. Power unchecked has often found its cruelest expression in the violation of bodies. Yet, in Caligula's Rome, this was not hidden in shadows, but flaunted beneath candlelight, the humiliation of others paraded as imperial entertainment. In this theatre of cruelty, Caligula was both playwright and lead actor, directing scenes where lust and tyranny became indistinguishable. Those who watched had no choice but to play their parts in silence, knowing that even resistance in thought could be punished. It was not merely about indulgence, it was about control, the deliberate stripping away of dignity, until only submission remained. This, then, is where our story begins. Not in whispered rumour alone, but in a Rome where power extended into every chamber, every marriage bed, every banquet table. To understand Caligula is to understand how intimacy itself became imperial property. And as we move deeper into his reign, we will see how these acts of cruelty multiplied, weaving together rumour, reality, and fear into one of history's darkest legacies. Caligula's reign turned even the sanctity of marriage into a weapon. In Roman culture, matrimony was not merely a personal bond, but a transaction of prestige, wealth, and lineage. To take a wife by force, to tear her from husband or family, was to wound entire houses, to stain dynasties. Caligula knew this, and he exploited it ruthlessly. The stories begin with Junia Claudilla, his first wife. She was not seized, but chosen a daughter of the noble Junii family, a marriage alliance meant to tie Caligula closer to Rome's oldest bloodlines. Yet, her life was short. She died in childbirth before Caligula had become emperor. Her fate was tragic, but it was only the prelude to the cruelties that followed. With his growing power came growing disregard for consent, family, or decency. Next came Livia, Orestilla, remembered not for love, but for her abduction. The accounts say it happened at her own wedding banquet. Guests feasted, musicians played, and the groom, a senator of fine standing, stood proud beside his new bride. Then Caligula entered. His gaze fell upon Livia Orestilla, radiant in her bridal garb, and he declared that she belonged not to her husband, but to him. Before the stunned assembly could react, the emperor took her, the bride of another, into his custody. The groom was humiliated, the marriage annulled by sheer force of imperial will. Orestilla was elevated to empress in name, but banished within days when Caligula grew bored. Her life, her dignity, her future, all had been reshaped in a single brutal act of appetite. Then there was Lollia Paulina, famed for her beauty and immense wealth. She too was ripped from her husband, who was ordered to divorce her so she could become the emperor's bride. For a brief moment, Paulina was at the center of Rome's stage, displayed as another jewel in Caligula's collection. Yet, like Orestilla, she too was discarded, exiled, and forbidden ever to remarry or bear children. What Rome saw was not marriage, but theatre, a woman seized, displayed, and abandoned. Each union followed a pattern: abduction, possession, humiliation, and exile. No alliance was sacred, no bride safe from imperial desire. These were not acts of passion, but rituals of domination. Caligula wielded marriage as both sword and spectacle. Senators, terrified, whispered of whose daughter or wife might be taken next. Fathers dreaded the emperor's glance. Husbands lived in silent fear. Families once proud of their lineage now trembled at the possibility of their bloodline being bound, however briefly, to his destructive embrace. Ancient writers describe these marriages not as unions, but as violations, political earthquakes disguised as nuptials. To abduct a bride before her wedding guests, to discard her as though she were a banquet dish, was to defile the very values Rome claimed to cherish: dignity, continuity, and the sacredness of the family. Caligula's message was clear. No institution, no ritual, not even marriage lay beyond his reach. Rome had known emperors who manipulated unions for political advantage. Augustus had arranged and rearranged marriages across the Julio-Claudian line to bind allies and strengthen heirs. But Caligula's version was different. He married not for dynasty, not for legacy, but for sport. He twisted an institution meant to preserve honor into one designed to annihilate it. In doing so, he broke more than vows. He broke the fragile trust between emperor and elite, turning every wedding feast into a potential stage for abduction. Thus, in the shadow of Caligula's reign, brides were not symbols of hope or continuity. They were warnings. Every forced union whispered the same message into Rome's ears: your daughters are mine, your wives are mine, your pride is mine, and I will take, discard, and destroy them as I please. If marriage was one arena of domination, the banquet was another. Roman dining halls were designed for spectacle, marble floors reflecting the glow of oil lamps, couches arranged in elegant triclinium-style silver platters carrying delicacies from every corner of the empire. But under Caligula, these feasts were transformed from celebrations of abundance into stages of degradation. Ancient accounts describe how the emperor delighted in parading the wives of Rome's senators and nobles before assembled guests. Draped in fine garments adorned with jewels, these women were not honored participants, but unwilling exhibits in Caligula's theater of humiliation. With a gaze that could silence the room, he would inspect them like cattle at market, commenting on their appearance, weighing their allure. The room would grow taut with fear because everyone knew what might follow. At a gesture, Caligula would seize whichever woman caught his eye. Before her husband, before the Senate's most powerful men, she would be escorted into a private chamber. The doors closed, and the emperor's will became her prison. What transpired inside was less important to him than what came after. When he emerged, he would recount with mocking detail her performance. He relished describing their intimacy, not in private whispers, but in public jeers, turning a woman's violation into a weapon against her husband. Imagine the senators seated around those couches, forced to laugh, to nod, to hide the rage burning behind their eyes. To object was to invite death. To remain silent was to endure the public stripping of one's honor. Rome's elite had always prized dignity, the dignitas that defined their standing in society. But in these banquets, Caligula dismantled dignity with surgical cruelty. He showed them that their wives, their homes, their very manhood were vulnerable to imperial whim. To understand the horror, we must remember how public honor defined Roman politics. A man's reputation was currency. His household reflected his status. By taking wives into his chamber and returning to boast Caligula was not merely indulging lust. He was dismantling the political order, asserting that all honor, all virtue, flowed only from him. What Rome heard in his boasts was a declaration: I own you. I own your family. I own the memory of your shame. The banquets became rituals of power. Food and wine dulled the senses, but no amount of luxury could disguise the fear that clung to the air. Guests laughed on cue, forced to applaud anecdotes that cut like knives. Husbands drank deeply, hoping to numb the humiliation. Wives trembled, knowing they could be summoned at any moment. Even the servants, silent in their duties, carried whispers from hall to street, spreading the poison of rumor that made Caligula's cruelty echo beyond the palace walls. In these feasts, we glimpse the true perversity of his rule. It was not simply that he violated women, but that he forced men to collude in their own dishonor. Each banquet chipped away at the Senate's authority, turning noblemen into silent participants in their wives' degradation. This was power made intimate, power exercised not through decrees or armies, but through the bodies of Rome's most respected families. And yet the cruelty was calculated. By transforming private intimacy into public theatre, Caligula ensured that shame itself became a tool of governance. Senators lived in dread not only of punishment, but of humiliation so public, so indelible, that no amount of political achievement could erase it. Thus, the dining halls of Rome became stages of fear. The wine cups gleamed, the platters overflowed, but beneath the music of flutes and the fragrance of incense lay a silence heavy with submission. For those who dined with Caligula, every feast was a gamble, whether they would leave merely humiliated or utterly destroyed. Among all the tales of Caligula's reign, none scandalized Rome more than the whispers surrounding his bond with his sister Drusilla. To the Romans, family was sacred. Marriage was regulated by law and incest. Especially within the imperial family was not just taboo, but unthinkable. Yet, ancient historians record that Caligula shattered this most fundamental boundary, reshaping it into a spectacle of his power. Drusilla was no ordinary sister. She was the youngest daughter of Germanicus' beloved general, an heir apparent to the empire before his untimely death. Caligula, born Gaius, was adored as the child who wore miniature military boots. The nickname Caligula means little boot. Growing up, he and his sisters were symbols of continuity for the dynasty of Augustus. But when fate elevated him to emperor in 37 CE, he repurposed these family bonds into tools of control. Sources like Suetonius and Cassius Dio describe how Caligula flaunted his closeness to Drusilla in public, not as siblings, but as consorts. At banquets, he had her seated beside him in places normally reserved for wives. He showered her with honors unprecedented for a sister, elevating her status to that of partner in empire. Some accounts even claim that he forced Drusilla's husband into humiliation, separating them so that she could remain with him. The most shocking stories insist that Caligula treated Drusilla as his wife in all but name. Ancient gossip, always eager to conflate rumor with fact, claimed that their relationship was not merely affectionate, but sexual. Whether exaggerated or not, the effect was the same. The image of incest became a weapon against Caligula's reputation, proof to many Romans that he had abandoned human restraint altogether. When Drusilla died suddenly in 38 CE, likely from illness, Caligula's grief stunned the empire. He ordered a period of public mourning, usually reserved for emperors, and declared her a goddess, consecrating her as Diva Drusilla Panthea. Statues depicted her as Venus, the goddess of love and beauty. To Romans, this was more than eccentric devotion. It blurred the lines between kinship sexuality and religion. By elevating his sister to divine status, Caligula proclaimed that their bond was cosmic, sanctified beyond earthly criticism. The symbolism of incest disturbing as it was carried political weight. In the logic of absolute monarchy, where emperors claimed divine descent uniting with one's sister, echoed myths of gods and pharaohs. The Egyptians had long traditions of sibling marriages among royals. Pharaohs married sisters to preserve purity of the divine bloodline. By mirroring such practices, Caligula signaled that he too was above human law, that Rome, like Egypt, would bow to a god-king unfettered by mortal conventions. But Romans were not Egyptians. Their society prized mos maiorum, the ancestral traditions that defined honor and morality. To flaunt incest was not just indecency, it was treason against cultural order. Senators recoiled, yet they dared not oppose him openly. To challenge the emperor's sister was to risk one's life. So silence became complicity, and every public honor bestowed upon Drusilla deepened the collective unease. Her death left a wound in Caligula that festered into further instability. Ancient writers claim that his grief tipped into mania, that he spoke to her ghost, that he invoked her name in the most private moments, that he demanded temples and sacrifices in her honor. Whether true or embroidered, these tales painted a picture of a ruler who had merged family religion and power into a single theater of obsession. For Rome, Drusilla became both victim and symbol. If she was indeed forced into an incestuous relationship, she was another woman stripped of agency by imperial desire. If she was honored as a goddess, she became an unwilling participant in the transformation of the empire into Caligula's personal stage. Either way, her body, her name, and her memory were seized for political performance. The scandal of Caligula and Drusilla endured not because of lurid gossip alone, but because it embodied the emperor's philosophy of rule. Nothing was sacred, not law, not religion, not even the sanctity of kinship. By making his sister both consort and goddess, he announced to Rome that he was bound by no moral limit, that intimacy itself had become another instrument of domination. And in that revelation lay the empire's deepest fear. If even the emperor's sister could be consumed by his will, then no household in Rome was safe from intrusion. Families whispered behind closed doors, mothers shielded daughters, husbands feared dishonor. The boundaries of privacy collapsed, and with them the fragile illusion that power stopped at the threshold of the home. Thus, the story of Drusilla is not merely about incest. It is about power, masquerading as intimacy grief, weaponized into divinity, and the collapse of Rome's most fundamental taboos under the shadow of one man's unrestrained will. If Drusilla's story blurred the sacred lines of kinship, the next phase of Caligula's reign showed how he extended the same violation outward, ensnaring men and women from across Rome's social spectrum. To the emperor, sex was never simply pleasure, it was politics, domination, and control. Every body in his reach became a pawn in the theater of humiliation. Ancient sources are replete with accusations that Caligula forced himself upon senators' wives, noble sons, and foreign hostages alike. Suetonius writes of a court where power and intimacy fused so completely that no distinction remained between private indulgence and public punishment. Marcus Lepidus, once considered an ally and even groomed as a potential successor, was said to have shared Caligula's bed. Yet, when he fell out of favor, his closeness became his downfall. He was executed. His intimacy with the emperor transformed into evidence of treason. There was also Mnester, a celebrated actor whose performances enchanted Rome. Caligula, enthralled, made him a constant companion, but companionship with the emperor was never voluntary. Mnester, was dragged into orgies and competitions, ordered to perform not only on stage, but in the emperor's bedchamber. To be desired by Caligula was not an honor, but a sentence, a mark that one's life no longer belonged to oneself. Foreign hostages too became ensnared. Sons of client kings and envoys from provinces found themselves compelled to serve imperial appetites under the guise of hospitality. What began as diplomacy often ended in forced submission, the humiliation of entire nations embodied in the degradation of their children. By violating the heirs of allies, Caligula made a statement more powerful than any treaty Rome owned, not just lands and armies, but flesh and dignity. This was domination at its rawest. In Roman culture, masculinity was defined by who penetrated and who submitted. To accuse the emperor of taking noblemen into his bed was not to mock his lust, but to emphasize his tyranny. He inverted Rome's ideals of power, reducing senators and aristocrats to the status of slaves. What mattered was not whether the stories were true in every detail, but that they were told that Rome believed its emperor had erased the distinctions between master and victim, ruler and subject. And within this climate of enforced desire, affection was impossible. Caligula's so-called lovers lived in a state of dread, aware that devotion meant nothing against the whims of an unstable god-emperor. Today, historians debate whether these accounts were exaggerated by political enemies. But even if some tales were slander, their consistency reveals how Romans experienced his rule as one in which intimacy itself had become a tool of governance. To be close to Caligula was to be consumed by him. Your will erased your body, made into a stage where empire played out its cruelties. The cruelty of Caligula's reign was not confined to private chambers. Its true weight lay in the way it spread like smoke, seeping into every corridor of Rome's political and domestic life. Senators, generals, priests, and wealthy households lived under a constant shadow, never sure when the emperor's eye would fall upon them, or worse, upon their wives and children. The city itself pulsed with unease. At banquets, noble families tried to mask their terror with forced laughter, their smiles brittle as they watched Caligula scan the room. At any moment, he might signal for a senator's wife to rise, appraise her before the assembled guests, and vanish with her into an adjoining chamber. Upon his return, he would narrate in detail her performance. Leaving her husband dishonored his dignity, trampled his loyalty, publicly tested. To endure such humiliation and remain silent was to survive. To protest even faintly was to invite death. The boundaries between public and private collapsed. A Roman home had always been a sanctuary of the paterfamilias, where the father's authority ruled supreme. Caligula shattered that sacred boundary. A senator might have commanded thousands of men on campaign, yet he was powerless to defend his household from imperial intrusion. His daughters were potential targets, his sons potential victims. Fathers who once prided themselves on protecting family honor were reduced to trembling spectators in the emperor's theater of cruelty. This atmosphere of dread was not limited to the elite. The whispers traveled down Rome's narrow streets and into its crowded insulae. Merchants, freedmen, and slaves all knew the stories. Rome's empire was vast, but its capital had become a court of terror where no rank offered safety. Even foreign envoys who came bearing gifts of tribute returned home with tales not only of Rome's might, but of an emperor whose desires made diplomacy a risk of dishonor. The climate of fear functioned as governance. Laws mattered less than glances, and policies were made not in the Senate, but in the emperor's bedchamber. Men who might have opposed Caligula's decrees held their tongues afraid of the rumors he could unleash, or the humiliations he could orchestrate. Fear became a currency traded more effectively than gold binding Rome's most powerful men in silent submission. For ordinary Romans, spectacle was nothing new. Gladiatorial combat, public executions, and theatrical dramas all blurred lines between entertainment and horror. Yet, under Caligula, even intimacy became performance, another stage on which power was displayed. Those closest to him lived in permanent suspense, never knowing when their private shame might be transformed into tomorrow's public story. Rome had known tyrants before, but never had the empire been so steeped in humiliation as a method of rule. With every forced marriage, every whispered rumor, every wife paraded, and every senator cowed, Caligula cultivated not just obedience, but paralysis. To live in his Rome was to live in a city where silence was safety, and every relationship, whether between husband and wife, father and child, or friend and friend, might be tested broken or betrayed by the emperor's will. Our understanding of Caligula comes to us not through his own words, few survive, but through the pens of others. And those pens were dipped as much in venom as in ink. To reconstruct his reign is to walk through a hall of distorted mirrors where scandal, slander, and memory intertwine. The most notorious voices are Suetonius Tacitus and Cassius Dio, men who wrote with sharp disdain for emperors who overstepped Rome's fragile balance of power. Suetonius, in the Lives of the Caesars, paints Caligula as a monster of appetites, an emperor who treated sisters as wives, who auctioned off senators' wives at feasts, who declared himself a living god. Tacitus, though more restrained, casts the reign as one of moral collapse, a study in how power corrodes a man's soul. Cassius Dio, writing later, expands the gossip into grim set-pieces tales of orgies, incest, and debasement. But here lies the difficulty. All three wrote after Caligula's death, and none were free of bias. Rome had a tradition of vilifying its fallen rulers. To smear a tyrant with charges of sexual perversion was almost formulaic. It was easier to explain cruelty by portraying emperors as deranged than to confront the structural violence of empire itself. Augustus, Tiberius, Nero, Domitian all became villains in histories penned by hostile elites. Caligula, whose reign ended in assassination, was remembered with special venom. Still, propaganda does not erase reality. The accounts converge too consistently to dismiss everything as invention. There were forced marriages, humiliations at banquets, whispered stories of Drusilla, and accusations of lovers taken by coercion. The question is not whether Caligula was cruel, but how much of the cruelty was embellished. Was he truly the incestuous madman of Suetonius's pages, or did Rome's moralists amplify each scandal until it became legend? Modern historians tread carefully. Scholars like Alois Winterling suggest that many tales of debauchery were politically coded critiques. To say an emperor slept with senators' wives was shorthand for saying he humiliated the Senate. To claim he desecrated his sisters was a way of expressing outrage at his disregard for social boundaries. In other words, the gossip functioned as political shorthand, a language of condemnation that blurred fact and metaphor. Even so, fragments of truth glimmer beneath the rhetoric. Archaeological evidence coins inscriptions, decrees, confirms his grandiose self-presentation as a living deity. We know he staged elaborate spectacles, demanded worship, and punished senators who resisted. Whether or not he truly indulged in every sexual horror described his reign was remembered as one where intimacy itself became politicized, turned into theater at the expense of Rome's elite. Thus, the historian's task is delicate. We cannot strip away propaganda entirely, nor can we swallow it whole. We must read Suetonius not as a neutral reporter, but as a moralist, telling a cautionary tale. We must see Tacitus not just as chronicler, but as senator, writing with the bitterness of the dispossessed. We must understand Dio's embellishments as part of a Roman tradition where tyrants were always monstrous, never merely human. And in this tangled web of rumor and record, the victims risk vanishing. For what matters is not only whether every detail is true, but that the fear, the humiliation, and the abuse were real enough to shape how Rome remembered Caligula. His reputation, whether exaggerated or not, was carved into history as the embodiment of what happens when power exceeds all bounds. To read Caligula's story only through the eyes of his enemies is to see a shadow without substance. Was he truly the monstrous figure described by Suetonius? Or was he a man broken by illness, isolation, and the crushing weight of absolute rule? Between these two images, monster and man, lies the space where history struggles to find truth. When Caligula first rose to power in 37 CE, the empire exhaled with relief. He was the son of Germanicus Rome's golden boy, beloved by soldiers and citizens alike. The people greeted his accession with festivals, sacrifices, and parades. For a brief time, Caligula seemed destined to be the perfect heir, generous, charming, and deeply adored. Ancient accounts record him granting tax relief, freeing prisoners unjustly held, and showering the populace with games and spectacles. For 6 months, his rule appeared humane. Then came the illness. In October of that same year, Caligula fell gravely sick. Ancient writers describe it as a brain fever, though modern historians speculate it may have been epilepsy, encephalitis, or even lead poisoning from Rome's pipes and cosmetics. Whatever the cause, when he recovered, the emperor seemed transformed. The charm had curdled into cruelty, the generosity into suspicion. He no longer smiled as Rome's darling, but glared as if everyone plotted against him. His paranoia deepened with every whisper of treason. Here, the historian Alois Winterling and others urge us to pause. Were his excesses the product of madness, or were they calculated acts of terror meant to keep rivals at bay? Rome's Senate had always resented strong emperors, and Caligula knew well the fate of those who underestimated aristocratic plots. Some of his cruelties, confiscating property, humiliating senators, can be seen as deliberate strategies to remind the ruling class of their helplessness. But illness cannot be dismissed. Ancient medicine lacked the language of neurology or psychiatry, but the symptoms recorded suggest real suffering. Sudden mood swings, erratic behavior, compulsive acts of humiliation. These may have been the scars of trauma or disease, and layered upon this was the profound loneliness of power. Caligula had grown up in an atmosphere of betrayal. His father Germanicus poisoned his mother, exiled his brothers, executed. He survived not through trust, but through silence. By the time he wore the imperial purple, mistrust was not paranoia, it was survival. To say he was mad risks oversimplifying. To say he was merely cruel risks excusing. The truth may be that he was both a man whose fragile mind collapsed under the intoxication of unchecked authority, and who discovered that fear was a faster path to obedience than love. His reign then was not random perversion, but a grim theatre, where humiliation was a weapon sharpened by his own wounds. The line between pathology and politics is thin. When Caligula paraded senators' wives or elevated his sister Drusilla as a goddess, was he sick? Or was he staging deliberate spectacles of dominance? When he demanded worship in temples, was it insanity or calculated theatre to bend Rome to his will? The answer may never be clear, and perhaps that ambiguity is itself the lesson. For in Caligula's story, monster and man are inseparable, fused in the crucible of empire. What remains undeniable is the legacy of fear. Whether driven by illness strategy or both, Caligula turned intimacy into humiliation, affection into control, and spectacle into domination. And in doing so, he forced Rome to confront the darkest truth of autocracy, that when one man holds absolute power, his private pathologies can become the empire's public nightmare. Every story of Caligula's reign is haunted by the women who moved through his orbit, not as free agents, but as figures whose bodies, reputations, and futures were bound to the emperor's whims. Their names appear in sources as footnotes to scandal, but behind each name was a life altered, often destroyed, by his desire to make women into props in his theatre of domination. Take Junia Claudilla, his first wife. Ancient writers say she died young in childbirth, but Caligula's grief was fleeting. Her memory barely lingered before he turned to others, seizing new wives as though they were trinkets to be exchanged. Livia, Orestilla, abducted straight from her wedding to another man, was elevated to empress for a matter of days before being discarded, forbidden to ever return to her true husband. Lollia Paulina, celebrated for her beauty and wealth, was summoned, married, and exiled in a single imperial gesture. Their marriages were not partnerships, but proclamations the emperor could take and unmake, bonds at will. Even his sister's women, who might have been expected to enjoy a measure of protection in the imperial household, became tools of spectacle. Agrippina the Younger, Julia Livilla, and most infamously Drusilla, each was drawn into the net of rumor and suspicion. Drusilla, the supposed favorite, was honored above all, treated as though she were not only sister, but consort. To Rome, this blurred the lines of family and morality, shaking the very foundations of Roman values. When she died in 38 CE, Caligula commanded that she be deified, her name spoken in the language of goddesses. It was meant to elevate her, but in the whispers of Rome, it marked the empire's descent into decadence. What is striking in these stories is the silence of the women themselves. We hear nothing of their voices, their choices, their pain. Ancient chroniclers tell us what Caligula did, but not how his victims endured. Did Lollia Paulina weep when she was exiled, or did she cling to dignity? Did Livia Orestilla long for the husband she had been torn from? Did Drusilla willingly embrace the role her brother imposed, or did she simply have no means to refuse? History leaves us their names, but steals their humanity. Caligula's court reduced women to symbols. Wives were trophies. Sisters were vessels of scandal. Mistresses were pawns. Yet, in that reduction lies a truth about Rome itself. The empire that glorified power also normalized the erasure of women's agency. Caligula did not invent the objectification of women. He magnified it, wielding marriage and intimacy as blunt instruments of control. But perhaps the most haunting legacy of these women is their endurance. They survived in the only ways they could, through silence, through submission, through the faint hope of exile, rather than death. In their shadows, we glimpse resilience, the quiet, unrecorded resistance of living on when the empire tried to erase you. They remind us that tyranny is not only measured by the cruelty of rulers, but by the silenced stories of those forced to endure them. If Caligula's treatment of women scandalized Rome, his dealings with men shook it to its core. For in a society built on rigid hierarchies of gender and power, the emperor blurred lines that Romans held sacred. Masculinity was supposed to mean control, dominance, the right to command. A Roman senator prided himself on authority over his household, his clients, his soldiers. Yet, under Caligula, even the proudest men were reduced to trembling, uncertain of their standing, not because he stripped them of titles, but because he stripped them of dignity. Ancient accounts accuse him of taking men as lovers not out of affection, but as conquest. Marcus Lepidus, once his brother-in-law and a man of ambition, was rumoured to have shared his bed. Menester, a famous actor celebrated on the Roman stage, is said to have been compelled to perform not just before audiences, but in Caligula's private chambers. Other whispers told of young aristocrats, boys from the noblest families summoned to the palace under pretexts of honor, only to find themselves conscripts in the emperor's theater of submission. In each case, intimacy was never private. Afterward, Caligula made sure others knew. Just as he humiliated senators by flaunting their wives, he emasculated men by boasting of what he had made them do. In Rome's cultural code, the role of the penetrated was shameful. To be placed in that position was to be branded weak, unmanly, subservient. That stigma was exactly what Caligula weaponized. His liaisons were not passion, they were political performance. Every whisper of a senator's forced submission, every rumor of an actor's degradation reinforced the same message: no one was safe, no one untouchable. This inversion of power cut at the heart of Roman identity. The empire prided itself on virtuous manly courage, control, mastery. Caligula shattered that illusion by making senators equestrians and noble sons endure roles their culture declared dishonorable. He turned their very bodies into stages of domination. In doing so, he revealed that in an empire ruled by a single man, even the most powerful could be made powerless. Modern scholars caution us to sift rumor from truth. Roman historians loathed Caligula, and accusations of sexual degradation were their sharpest weapon. But whether each detail was literal or exaggerated, the effect was the same. The image of senators emasculated generals, reduced to playthings noblemen forced into roles of shame, lingered as part of his legacy. It was not just women who lived in his shadow, but men who found that their masculinity, once their armor could be shattered with a glance from the emperor. In this, Caligula's reign revealed the ultimate irony in a world obsessed with dominance. He proved that power itself could redefine masculinity. To resist was death. To submit was disgrace. And in that impossible choice lay the emperor's cruelest victory. To understand Caligula's reign, we must see how humiliation was not random, but ritualized a system of degradation woven into the fabric of imperial spectacle. Just as Rome had its gladiatorial games, its executions in the amphitheater, Its triumphal processions through the forum, so too did Caligula craft private ceremonies in which intimacy itself became a form of state performance. He did not simply seize a senator's wife or summon a young nobleman to his chambers in secret. He staged these moments with deliberate flourish. Banquets became theatres of exposure, wives paraded before guests like cattle, at market men forced to watch their spouses vanish behind palace curtains, only to return with their dignity mocked. Guests sat in gilded halls, forced to laugh nervously at the emperor's crude retellings, knowing that silence would be read as disloyalty and laughter as complicity. In those moments, the line between dinner party and tribunal blurred. Every smile was an oath of survival. Caligula's inspections were infamous. Sources claim he would order women of rank to stand before him, strip them of jewelry sometimes, of clothing, running his eyes over them as if appraising slaves. He was not choosing companions, he was demonstrating ownership. A gesture that in any other man would have been crime became under him a ritual of power, a reminder that the empire's most sacred boundaries of family, marriage, and dignity existed only at his pleasure. In Rome, the public arena was where violence became entertainment. Gladiators bled for crowds, criminals were executed, before cheering masses, slaves were paraded in chains. Caligula's genius, or his madness, was to take this culture of spectacle and turn it inward. In his court intimacy, replaced blood, and humiliation replaced swords. The same theatrical rhythm held the anticipation, the climax of exposure, the forced applause. What changed was the stage. By doing so, he redefined politics as theatre. Senators no longer debated with reasoned oratory. They competed to hide their shame. Nobility no longer displayed their gravitas. They displayed their forced compliance. The rituals of degradation hollowed out Rome's institutions, replacing the Republic's old pride with the emperor's cruel performance art. For the victims, the pain was not only in the act, but in its retelling. Rome was a city of memory, where reputation was a second life. By recounting what he had done, Caligula condemned his victims to endless humiliation. Even when their bodies were untouched, their names were soiled, their honor trampled. It was punishment that left no scars but could destroy a lineage. Thus, every ritual of degradation was more than personal cruelty. It was governance by shame. In a culture where honor was life itself, Caligula discovered the sharpest blade, stripping people of the dignity that no legion, no Senate vote could restore. In the marble corridors of Rome, silence was as dangerous as words. Caligula's reign thrived not only on what he did, but on what people believed he might do. Scandal itself became a governing tool. Rumors circulated like wildfire through senatorial households and plebeian taverns alike. Stories of abductions, incest, grotesque banquets. No one knew how much was true, but that uncertainty was part of his design. Within the domus of Rome's elite, whispered conversations carried the weight of survival. Families rehearsed what they would say if summoned to the palace. Husbands warned wives to avoid his gaze at festivals. Mothers taught daughters to keep their eyes lowered when passing imperial guards. In such a climate, rumor was not idle chatter. It was preparation, a shield against the unpredictable storm of imperial whim. Every household became a theatre of dread. Imagine a senator's wife dressing for a feast. Each necklace, each clasp of her gown, chosen with care too plain, and she might be mocked too ornate, and she might catch his eye. Husbands knew that dignity could be shattered in a single night, yet refusing an invitation meant suspicion of treason. The whisper that Caligula desired your wife was as lethal as a blade at your throat. Even among ordinary Romans, tales of imperial excess spread in hushed tones. Bakers spoke of noblewomen carried off mid-procession. Water sellers recounted how senators walked the forum with hollow eyes after returning from the palace. Whether these accounts were true or not mattered less than the fact they were believed. Fear blurred the boundary between fact and fiction, making every rumor a weapon. This was governance by shame and imagination. If a senator dared oppose him, Caligula did not need to strike directly. He could simply let slip a hint, a sly suggestion, and the senator's peers would complete the work, isolating him in suspicion. The threat of disgrace was so pervasive that Rome itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next scandal. Historians tell us that Caligula's rule was short, less than 4 years yet. In those years, rumor replaced law as the empire's glue. His cruelty lived not only in deeds, but in the shadows they cast. Each whispered tale became both memory and prophecy. Each story of humiliation, ensuring that senators and citizens alike obeyed not from loyalty, but from terror of becoming the next story whispered in another household. When history speaks of Caligula, it often does so with fascination for his excesses, his outrages, his cruelty, dressed as theatre. Yet beneath the spectacle are human lives, women and men, whose dignity was torn apart in ways that are rarely allowed the solemnity of remembrance. To tell this chapter properly, we must pause the gaze on the emperor himself, and turn instead to those who bore the weight of his abuses, the silenced, the humiliated, the forgotten. Consider Junior Claudilla Caligula's first wife. She is remembered briefly in the sources for dying in childbirth, her absence used almost like an opening in a play that allowed his later horrors to unfold. Yet, what of her life before? She was a Roman noblewoman, her marriage a bond of political alignment. Did she imagine a future as the steadying force beside her husband, perhaps softening his edges, as imperial wives were sometimes expected to do? Instead, her name is a prelude to tragedy, reduced to the role of a shadowy figure whose death stripped Caligula of restraint. Then came Livia Orestilla, whose story still chills the imagination. She was seized during her own wedding banquet, in full view of her family, her friends, her new husband. Ancient accounts tell us Caligula simply declared her marriage void, making her his bride by fiat. The humiliation did not end there. Days later, he dismissed her, forbidding her ever to return to her first husband. Imagine the shame of walking back into her family's world, tainted by scandal, neither a wife nor a widow, but a discarded possession of the emperor. Hers was not just a broken marriage, it was the erasure of her social identity. Lollia Paulina's tale was no kinder. A woman famed for her beauty and wealth, she was chosen, paraded as consort, and then just as suddenly exiled. Exile in Rome was not only physical banishment, but social death. She was commanded never again to bear a child, as though her very womb had become an extension of imperial property. Through her, we glimpse how Caligula weaponized fertility itself, transforming reproduction, the sacred continuation of family and lineage, into something he controlled with a gesture. And then there is Drusilla, the most haunting figure in this gallery of shadows. She was his sister, beloved beyond measure, raised not only as kin, but as something akin to a divine partner. Ancient writers whisper of an incestuous bond, her presence at his side, scandalizing Roman elites. Upon her death, Caligula deified her, elevating her to the rank of goddess. Was she cherished or trapped? Did she wield power of her own, or was she consumed by his obsession? The silence of her own voice leaves only questions. What remains certain is that her image was twisted into both symbol and tool. Her life transformed into myth in service of an emperor's ego. The wives of senators suffered perhaps the most public degradation. In the candlelit banquets, these women pillars of their households were displayed like commodities. When Caligula desired one, he would lead her away under the eyes of her husband and peers. Upon returning, he would describe in lurid detail what had occurred, reducing noble women to subjects of laughter and sneering amusement. The humiliation was doubled. Their bodies violated their honor, mocked their marriages shattered as their husbands were forced into silence, their authority stripped before the eyes of Rome. Beyond the nobility were the nameless. Young aristocrats accused of being Caligula's lovers, provincial hostages offered as tokens of loyalty. Even actors like Menester, who were rumored to be drawn into his private world. For them, there was no memory carved in marble, no tomb relief to preserve their faces. They survive only as vague figures in ancient texts reduced to rumor, accusation, or example. Yet, they were human beings, each with families, dreams, and dignity, caught in the machinery of power that treated their bodies as expendable. What binds all these victims together is the way their suffering was made. Spectacle. Unlike the private cruelties of most tyrants, Caligula's degradations were often public, intentional, designed to humiliate not just the individual, but the network of family and allies surrounding them. To violate a wife was to weaken her husband. To parade a sister was to undermine the sanctity of the household. To seize a hostage was to remind distant provinces that Rome's reach extended into the very bloodlines of their rulers. And yet, despite all this, history rarely gives these figures more than a passing line. They are remembered only in how they serve to illustrate the emperor's monstrousness. Their inner lives, their fears, their resilience, their moments of resistance are lost to silence. Did Livia or Astilla cry out at her wedding as she was taken away? Did Drusilla resent the divine honors or embrace them as survival? Did a senator's wife dragged back from Caligula's chambers ever whisper her rage in the darkness of her atrium? We cannot know, but to imagine is to begin to restore their humanity. The task before us is not to revel in scandal, but to honor the weight of what was endured. These victims remind us that tyranny leaves scars not just in politics, but in bodies, marriages, and families. Their names: Junia, Livia, Lollia, Drusilla, should not be footnotes in the biography of a tyrant. They should be remembered as women whose lives were bent and broken under the weight of unchecked power. And the nameless whose stories, dissolved into rumor, deserve to be seen not as shadows, but as human beings swallowed by history's cruelest theater. In their silence, there is still testimony. In their erasure, there is still witness. They are the truest indictment of Caligula's reign, not his excesses recounted with horror, but the human dignity he destroyed. The agency he stripped away, the resilience that could never be recorded. To speak their names, to pause in their memory, is to refuse to let their suffering dissolve into entertainment. It is to reclaim their humanity from the maw of empire. By the year 41 CE, Rome itself seemed to breathe in gasps of exhaustion. The empire had endured 4 years of Caligula's capricious cruelty of marriages mocked, of senators stripped of honor, of the city's most sacred bonds, twisted into parodies of loyalty and love. The palace had become a theater of humiliation, and the audience soldiers, courtiers, citizens had grown restless. Fear still reigned, but behind it smoldered something else, a desperate hunger for release. The Praetorian Guard. Those elite soldiers sworn to protect the emperor were not immune to this weariness. They had watched as Caligula's excesses turned their barracks into staging grounds for his madness. He had demanded loyalty while ridiculing their discipline. Some accounts even claim he humiliated officers by treating them as sexual pawns or by mocking their families in public feasts. The line between protector and prisoner blurred until the guard itself questioned whether their sworn duty was to Rome or to one man's appetites. The breaking point came in January. Ancient sources differ in their details, but the heart of the story is chillingly consistent. Caligula was leaving a theater striding through a narrow corridor lined with his guard. He was in high spirits, perhaps planning another spectacle, perhaps laughing at the senators who bowed too low as he passed. But behind him, blades were already drawn. Cassius Chaerea, a tribune of the guard, long mocked by Caligula as weak and effeminate, struck first. It was a wound both literal and symbolic. The man the emperor had humiliated reclaimed his dignity in blood. Others followed swiftly, stabbing, cutting, ensuring that Caligula, who had played the god, the master, the monster, was silenced before he could cry out commands. His wife Caesonia and even their young daughter were killed soon after a brutal effort to erase his lineage. The palace fell into chaos. Senators who had cowered for years now rushed to denounce him. Citizens whispered in relief, though some feared what would follow. The Praetorians, drenched in the emperor's blood, searched desperately for a successor, ultimately elevating his uncle Claudius, trembling and half-hidden behind a curtain to the throne. Rome did not mourn, it exhaled. But Caligula's fall was not just the death of one man. It was the collapse of a performance that had stretched Rome's tolerance for tyranny beyond its limits. His reign had weaponized intimacy, turned shame into policy, and proved that unchecked power could corrode not only the dignity of individuals, but the fabric of empire itself. The daggers that ended his life were not only the vengeance of wronged men, they were the desperate act of a society clawing its way back from the abyss. Yet the irony remains, even in death. Caligula retained power. His name became legend, his sins exaggerated, his memory shaped into a cautionary tale. In killing him, the Praetorians did not erase the theatre of cruelty. They preserved it in history's imagination, ensuring that his reign would echo not as a chapter of Rome's greatness, but as its most haunting parable of power abused. The body of Caligula was buried hastily stripped of imperial dignity, hidden away as if Rome itself wished to forget. Yet, history has never forgotten. His name, once Gaius Caesar, was eclipsed by the mocking nickname Caligula Little Boot, the soldier's child turned emperor, who became a byword for madness and cruelty. But what survives of him is not merely scandal or gossip. It is the unsettling mirror his reign still holds up to us today. Rome's historians painted him in broad, monstrous strokes. Suetonius wrote of incest, humiliation, and depravity. Cassius Dio recorded his taste for cruelty. Tacitus, though more cautious, preserved whispers that his court reeked of corruption. Modern scholars caution us to read with care, these men wrote, under emperors who benefited from Caligula's vilification. Propaganda shaped the picture, exaggerating, even inventing horrors to justify his assassination. And yet, behind the distortions lies a truth that no one can erase. Rome endured a reign where power lost all restraint. The lessons of Caligula's story are not about sexual scandal alone. They are about what happens when fear becomes governance, when intimacy itself is weaponized, when the emperor's bed becomes as political as the Senate floor. Whether every rumor was fact or slander, the effect was the same. A society paralyzed by humiliation, its noblest houses reduced to pawns in a theater of cruelty. For the women bound to him, wives, abducted sisters, consecrated mistresses, discarded his reign meant the theft of identity. For the men, he degraded senators, mocked hostages, coerced generals, emasculated. It meant the collapse of honor. These victims, faceless in many accounts, remind us that history is not only about tyrants, but also about those who endured them. Their suffering, obscured by sensational tales, deserves remembrance. Caligula's assassination did not end Rome's cycles of excess and cruelty. Emperors who followed Nero, Domitian, Commodus would each in their own way play their part in the theater of absolute power. What Caligula left was not only a scar, but a warning. Unchecked authority corrodes the private as surely as it corrupts the public. And so, nearly 2,000 years later, his story forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. How do we remember tyrants? Do we sensationalize their vices, turning them into entertainment while forgetting their victims? Do we reduce their reigns to scandal while ignoring the systems that allowed them to flourish? The palaces where Caligula once laughed and humiliated are ruins, now their stones silent. But their silence is not empty. It reminds us of the cost, when power slips beyond accountability, when cruelty is normalized, when dignity is sacrificed for spectacle. Perhaps that is the true legacy of Caligula, not simply the grotesque stories of incest and humiliation, but the enduring reminder that greatness without restraint curdles into terror, and that societies which tolerate the abuse of the powerless are complicit in their own undoing. And so the story closes, not with Caligula's name alone, but with an ethical echo. Rome's most infamous emperor lives on as a question to us all. What kind of world do we create when fear rules, when shame becomes governance, when humanity is forgotten in pursuit of power?